Good afternoon together in Dresden and on your monitors. We would like to welcome you to an IOER-Forum. For this afternoon, I would like to welcome Professor Judith Verstegen from University of Utrecht to today's IOER-Forum and the talk we have today and the debate after it. To give a short framing, why we are very happy that she's with us today, it's that the research area for spatial information modeling is currently keen in making use of the long time series we have for German land use data, for building data, and to find out more about structures, processes behind these, and also conceptually develop with regard to developing cause-effect relationship concepts. That means we develop theory and empirical approaches, and we are doing this because we want to learn how settlement structures, how open space structures developed in the last years, and how we can assess this in terms of sustainability and a transition towards sustainability. For us, this means a transition towards sustainable land use. And this is why we are, again, highly interested of Judith Verstegen's work, because she is keen in developing approaches that use modeling to identify underlying structures behind the spatial processes we can measure and see. And she's doing this via two approaches. One is through modeling and parameterizing and optimizing and to parameterize models, and also to optimize, use optimization approaches to find out how control variables can be used to identify what needs to be changed. And this allows then to think about path dependency and how systemic change happens in system and land use systems, but also how the systematic changes can be encouraged. And this is where we are interested in as a research institute that is looking at spatial transformation, so to understand why is urban development or open space development happening in the way it is in different locations, to contextualize this. And this is, yeah, this brings me to introduce her also as a speaker. Professor Judith Verstegen is assistant professor at the Department of Human Geography and Spatial Planning at Utrecht University. She focuses on two sets of methods. This is geosimulation modeling and optimization, spatial optimization. And what is also highly interesting is that she likes to work with domain experts. So to think, how can I get knowledge on context, local knowledge into GI models and learn more about systems. Yeah, before she worked in Utrecht, she was head of the Geosimulation modeling lab at University of Münster. So Judith, very happy to greet you here today, and we are very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthias. Thanks for the kind introduction. Welcome everyone to my talk today. I'm happy that you came with so many and also so many people online. Today, I will indeed talk about these two main methods that I'm using, geosimulation and spatial optimization, and I will do this in connection to human environment systems. First, I will shortly introduce what I mean with human environment systems. Then I will provide the definitions and explanations of the two methods. And then I will go into three case studies. One case study is about the geosimulation of pedestrians. Then one about spatial optimization of soil erosion in Ethiopia. And then finally, I will present a case study of where we combine the two methods and that you will see what kind of advantages that brings. And I will do that by the evaluation of a system of ethanol production in Brazil. And I will end with a summary. So what you see here is basically a depiction of our world and of the current global challenges that we face. For example, irrigation may cause water shortage, agricultural expansion may cause habitat fragmentation, air pollution in cities causes respiratory diseases among citizens, deforestation may cause carbon emissions, urban expansion may cause the soil to become impermeable, which increases the probability of floods. and land abandonment may cause erosion. You may think, okay, well, these are all quite different kind of problems. However, what's behind them is a similar thing, namely that we have a certain system, usually a natural system, and the state of that system changes over time because humans interact with that system. We see that, for example, in the case of irrigation. So we have a natural soil system, but because humans do something for their agriculture, namely water it, that causes changes in the state of that natural system, namely water shortage, and that has an effect of the nature surrounding it. So all of these are examples of human environment systems in our world. And in these human environment systems, we find certain impacts. The impacts are all the things that are on the right-hand side of the arrow. And all of my research is about studying these systems and their impacts. Geosimulation models, they model the system with the impact that we see as a result, whereas spatial optimization starts with the impact, tries to minimize that, and then sees what we should do with the system in order to achieve that. That was a very short explanation of the two methods, but now I'll go into more detail. So what's geosimulation? You may not be familiar with that term, but you may be familiar with the broader term spatiotemporal models. A spatiotemporal model is a computational representation of a certain system. That's depicted here in this conceptual diagram. The computational model consists of F, the transition function. That's a set of rules in the computer that represents the dynamics of our system. Here we see rule 1 up to rule n. How do we use that models? We use them in combination with inputs or drivers that simulate things that affect that system over time. And what we then model is Z, the state of the system and its changes over time. Once we know the state of the system and the changes over time, we can compute these impacts that are a result of that. We often use spatiotemporal models in combination with scenarios. Scenarios, they are certain storylines of how we envision the future of that system, and they often come as what-if questions. What would happen to the state of this system if we implement a certain policy, if we do another intervention in that system? And then what we do is plot the states of the system and their impacts. You can, for example, do that in such a graph. Here we have two scenarios, a business as usual scenario that has low costs because we do not implement many interventions, but then high environmental impacts. And scenario B that has higher costs because we implement a lot of interventions to try to make the system more sustainable, and because of that, reduced environmental impacts. Now, what's the difference between spatiotemporal models in general and geosimulation models specifically? That's indicated by this picture over here, by the table. Spatiotemporal models are a very broad range. They range from fully data-driven models to fully process-driven models. What I mean with data-driven models is that you start with empirical data and then fit a statistical model to that. That means that the model that you get is based on correlations between drivers and the system state, but you have no influence on the shape of that model or what kind of theory is included in it. Basically, there's no theory included in it. So it's a top-down type of modeling, you could say. These data-driven models are called empirically based models or statistical models, but machine learning models are also in this category. However, the type of models that I work with, they are process-driven. So you don't start with data at all, but you start with a theory about your system. What are the processes that are important in this system? What's the behavior of the people? And you implement the rules according to this theory in the model first without using data. Therefore, the model rules are based on known or assumed cause-effect relations of your systems. And the data comes later when you calibrate the parameters in the model. These types of models are called process-based models, physically based models, but also geosimulation. And difference between geosimulation and the other two terms is that it also refers to behavior of humans and not only natural processes. That's why I tend to use that term in my work. So here you see an example of what Z, the system state of a model, may look like. Here you see a model of the urban expansion of Madrid over time. Black is urban and white is non-urban, and then any color in between is that there's a certain probability of being urbanized in that year. One thing to note, and I recently wrote an opinion paper about that, is that geosimulation models, most of the time, they don't yield predictions. So it's not that the model is used to say, you know, this is going to happen tomorrow or next year. They yield projections. So the result of the model is not a probabilistic claim about the state of the future, but it's a conditional probabilistic claim. So we say, if we do this intervention, then this may happen with a certain probability. But because the intervention is not certain that it will happen, or is actually unlikely to happen, is not a prediction. It's not at all that we claim that that's going to happen. And this is very often confused. So please keep that in mind. It's a synthetic experiment. We control boundary conditions, and by controlling these boundary conditions, we learn about how the system works and what drivers we can influence and what that may cause, but it's not something we say will happen. So we use two main modeling paradigms in geosimulation modeling, agent-based and field-based. So in agent-based modeling, we represent the world as a set of discrete objects called agents, and all attributes in that system are then linked to these agents. The processes we implement are implemented as behavior of an agent that can be flexible in space, so it can move around. On the other hand, we have field-based models where the system state is continuous or discrete and has a value everywhere. And the behavior that we implement is the behavior of cells that remain in their location. So if in a field-based model we want to indicate movement, we need an object to be passed on through cells. So it's quite a different way of implementing your system. And this is, of course, analogous to the vector versus raster that you may know from GIS. So the next method, spatial optimization, as I said, it doesn't start from defining the system as a computational model, but it starts from the impacts. Any spatial optimization problem has three main components: objectives, control variables, sometimes called decision variables, and constraints. With the objectives, we define what we want to achieve. What we usually want to achieve to be sustainable is to minimize certain negative impacts, but on the other hand, to also minimize the costs that are related to that, because we don't have endless amounts of money or possibilities to change things in order to make things sustainable. Then you have a control variable. The control variable is the thing that you can change. So in a land use system, the control variable would be the land use. I am changing the land use at certain locations in order to reduce carbon emissions or to maximize biodiversity or to reduce the costs that are associated with these changes. And then as a third component, we usually, but not always, have constraints. Constraints, they are there in order to ensure that no unrealistic solutions are achieved. So in a land use system, you could say, okay, we cannot place croplands on water. This is a solution that we want to filter out if our algorithm realizes them. Here you see an example of a spatial optimization problem where we have 3 cities, and in these 3 cities, there are citizens that need to eat. And in order to provide them with this food, there are crops being cultivated at croplands, and the crops need to be transported to the cities as indicated by these arrows. What we could say here is we want to minimize the emissions resulting from transport by minimizing the total transport distance from the croplands to the cities. So basically what we do then is that these arrows, we make them our control variable. That's what we're changing. And our objective is to minimize the total distance, so the total length of all arrows. One result could be what you see in B. What has changed there is that the cropland over here is no longer be transported to this city because it's very far away, but now to this one. And in order to compensate for that, because of course we have a constraint that everybody needs to have enough food, this cropland the crops are now transported there. So that could be your result of the spatial optimization problem. Now here we have one control variable, but in reality often we have more complex problems with more control variables. For example, you could also change the type of crop or the diet of the citizens, etc., etc. So now I was talking about multiple control variables, but actually even more common is to have multiple objectives. Why do we have multiple objectives? Well, because we have multiple stakeholders that are related to these systems, and even a single stakeholder usually have multiple things that he or she wants to achieve. Common objectives are what we see here, the Sustainable Development Goals. And what's interesting about having multiple objectives is that sometimes there are synergies between these objectives. For example, here, Sustainable Development Goal 9, Industry, Innovation and Infrastructure, may have synergies with decent work and economic growth because building infrastructure creates work, so they go together. However, often there are also conflicts between objectives. For example, zero hunger and life on land, these two objectives may conflict with each other because if we want to have zero hunger, we may need to expand our croplands to produce more food, and that can go at the cost of natural vegetation and thereby decrease life on land. So these two objectives are conflicting with each other. That means that there are trade-offs between them. We cannot maximize both at the same time. And that's where spatial optimization becomes a really interesting technique, because we can visualize these trade-offs by doing spatial optimization and then plotting the results in a so-called Pareto front. You may know Pareto fronts from economic theory, or you may not, then I will explain it to you now. A Pareto front contains all solutions that are somehow optimal, and optimal means a solution on the Pareto front cannot be improved in one objective without making the other worse. So the Pareto front contains all solutions that are somehow a weighted optimum between these two objectives with varying weights. We can now quantify the trade-offs based on this Pareto front because the line tells us, okay, if we are here and we want to reduce our costs by 10%, then my environmental impacts will increase by 20%. And this type of information is, of course, useful in the decision-making debate because it's more transparent what we are trading for what if we want to go higher in one objective. Then to solve such optimization problems, we need solvers, and I'm not going to talk too much about that because it's a lot of technical detail, but what I do want to say about it is that there are two types of algorithms to solve spatial optimization problems: exact and heuristics or meta-heuristics. Exact algorithms, they find the real optimum. So here, for example, the real minimum of this function. But the problem is that they're often not feasible to apply to spatial optimization problem because space is complex, and because of that, it's not possible to algorithmically, to analytically solve that optimization problem. So because of that, we need heuristics, and heuristics are designed to efficiently find near optimal solutions. That means that we're not certain that it's the real minimum or maximum that we find. But it is feasible to use for spatial optimization problem because it searches the space in a smart way such that it doesn't need to evaluate all possible solutions. Good, now I will come to the 3 case studies. First, the case study of a geosimulation model. What I present here is the result of a project that I had in the last 3 years. It was a project funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung, and it was in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we were observing is here, this is my city, Utrecht, and during the corona pandemic, what they did is they implemented certain measures in order to try to stimulate physical distancing. In A, you see something interesting. They designed one-way streets for pedestrians. So for pedestrians, there were these traffic signs that you could walk only in one direction. In B, you see something that was also common here in Germany, these signs on the pavement that try to encourage you to keep right, so that the streams of pedestrians were not mixed, but they were more regulated. And then in C, in Utrecht, we even had a pedestrian roundabout. So like cars, you could only walk in one direction. In these pictures, we can already see some problems, because what you see here, if you look carefully, is a person walking in the wrong direction of the one-way street. Yeah. So people, they do not always stick to these rules, but it's very hard and costly to enforce that. You cannot put a policeman at every street corner to say, to give people fines when they walk in the wrong direction. So what we were interested in is to what extent people actually comply with such regulations, and what are the factors that influence this compliance. So our aim in this project was to evaluate the effect of the streetscape, so what's happening in the street, and potential interventions in it on the physical distancing behavior of pedestrians. And we did that by connecting 2 methods. One was a geosimulation model, in this case an agent-based model of how pedestrians move through a city. And we did interventions, so that's in this case the what-if scenario. The if is interventions for pedestrians. More specifically, we used the one-way street example. And then the other tool that we used was an immersive virtual environment. And we did that in order to find the behavior of the pedestrians. Namely, I told you in geosimulation, we implement theories in a model about behavior. But of course, in the case of physical distancing during a pandemic, there was no theory yet, because this was a completely new situation at the time. So we first had to find out what the behavior was about this compliance, non-compliance, before we could implement it in a simulation model. Here you see the agent-based model. This is Quakenbrück, a small city in Germany that you've probably never heard of. Is also not relevant where that is. We just took it as a city. And what you see here is the pedestrians walking around. These are the agents. The agents have an origin and a destination, and their behavior is that they formulate a route. The agents are at the beginning of their route not aware that there are interventions, because this is a new thing to them. But then sometimes they find these one-way streets, and they may or may not decide, decide to comply. You see some agents that comply, and in red, you also see sometimes agents that do not comply. Then about the immersive video environment, what we did was a user study in February 2022. In order to do that study, we recorded panoramic videos in Quakenbrück. You see that over here. So these are videos of all these street intersections of the model that you saw before. And we had 26 participants that had the same goal as the agent in our model, namely to reach a destination from the place where they were at that moment. They had to do this for 3 different cases, and in all 3 routes, there were about 5 to 8 decision points. And in these routes, there were 3 scenarios. One, where we told the participants, okay, there's no pandemic, you just do as you normally do. Then there was a scenario with pandemic. So people may decide to avoid busy places, I don't know. And then there was a 3rd scenario where we overlaid signs. So here you see one-way street signs. we put them as overlays in the video. So they're not real signs, but they are virtual signs, but we made them look as real as possible. The advantage of having these signs virtual is that there is no difference between these two scenarios other than the signs. So the video is completely the same people walk by. So in that way, we had a fully controllable experiment with just one difference, namely these signs. So we let them walk and we recorded what decisions they took, whether or not they complied with the signs. And we had a questionnaire at the end where we also asked them about the signs and about whether they felt safe and things like that. Here you see the results of both the user study and the agent-based model. Results of the user study, we recently published them in Interacting with Computers. And here you see two graphs. So two graphs. On the left-hand side is what is called the normalized detour. That's basically the difference between the shortest path that would be possible between origin and destination and what the participants did. And you see that in scenario 1, where there's a normal situation with no pandemic, people usually take the shortest path. So a difference of 0. Then when there is a pandemic, the mean increases a bit. So maybe sometimes they avoid busy parts. However, statistically, there was no significant difference between the two. Then when there are interventions, the difference becomes significant. So they take a path that's on average 50% longer than the shortest path. We also see the effect of the interventions in the second graph. That's the trespassing count. That is how many people walk on certain paths, so on the paths with interventions. So in the wrong way. And of course, here there are no signs, but on the roads that we later put interventions, there were on average 2 people, and here is reduced by 50%. So indeed, some people avoid these streets because there are interventions there. So then we took the knowledge that we got, because this told us something about how often people comply or do not comply with these interventions. We took that to the agent-based model, and then we had an agent-based model where we implemented interventions. And in the paper, of course, we varied the number of interventions to also see that effect. But here you see the results for 8 interventions, so the blue and the pink ones, these over here. This is the agent-based model people density with no interventions, and you see that we placed the one-way streets at the busy streets. So we placed one-way street signs here and at the roundabout where it's quite busy. And indeed, the interventions help to reduce the number of people on those streets. So for this number of people, that's 4,000 people in Quakenbrück, it helped. However, we also saw that when there are very few people, it doesn't really matter for the densities because there are so few people that it's not busy on these streets anyway. For double the amount of people, 8,000, we saw that it also didn't help because then there are so many people in Quakenbrück that it's always busy somewhere. Yeah, so you can make one-way streets, but then it's very busy somewhere else. So it doesn't really help anymore. So that was an example of what you can do with a geosimulation model. Now we come to the spatial optimization case study about soil erosion in Ethiopia. Soil loss endangers food supply now and in the future. So for example, the UN says that in 2050, soil loss could reduce up to 10% of crop yield. So it could have a really large impact. And what you could do to try to prevent or at least reduce this soil loss is soil and water conservation measures. However, of course, these come with certain costs. And these costs are especially relevant in countries where they don't have a large budget to implement such measures. So this is a spatial optimization case study where we look at 2 conflicting objectives, namely minimizing soil loss and minimizing labor costs. So we can already see that there will probably be a nice Pareto front between these 2 where we can see all optimal solutions. Our control variable is simple. We divide the study area in watersheds and we decide whether or not to put the conservation measures there. The special thing about this case study over here is that we also take into account uncertainty in the input data. So we say, okay, we have certain spatial data, but as you know, spatial data, they have errors or they have just things that we're not certain about, and because of that, there is uncertainty there. So what you see here is the difference between the 95th and the 5th percentile. So it's the 90% confidence interval range in 3 inputs, namely the labor days required to implement the measures at 1 hectare of land, the erodibility, the K factor in the soil loss equation, and the erosivity, the R factor in the soil loss equation. And when it's white, it's very certain. So there's 0 difference. It's between these percentiles. And when it's non-white, there is a certain uncertainty that propagates to our Pareto front. So what you will see in the end is that in this case study, our Pareto front is not a line, but is a range because there's uncertainty. And what you see here is what the algorithm does, but I don't want to go into detail about that. So here we see the results of this spatial optimization case study for 3 different sub-regions in Ethiopia. Here you see their location 1, 2, and 3. And then, so on the x-axis is the yearly soil loss in tons per hectare that we want to minimize. And on the y-axis is the labor requirement in labor days that we also want to minimize. Now, what you can also look at is these yellow and blue ranges. Yellow here and blue here. Yellow is the tolerable soil loss rates after some publication. So it basically means up to here is still okay to have that soil loss. Then in blue is the estimated available labor days for the farmers in Ethiopia. That means that up to here is possible. So basically what you want to do is to stay in the range that is both yellow and blue. So these are solutions that we could possibly implement. What we can already see is that in this study area, there's no overlap between yellow and blue and the Pareto front. That means that with the available labor that we have, we would never be able to achieve tolerable soil loss. The soil loss that we can achieve is always very high or higher than we would ideally like. And in the other 2 regions, it's actually possible. So why is there such high soil loss in this region? It's because there are higher slopes there. Another thing that's interesting to see is this uncertainty. You see here blue and red ranges. What we can see is that the uncertainty in the soil loss is higher than the uncertainty in the required labor. It's because the input data for soil loss has higher uncertainties. And then it's on average. So I told you about what you can use Pareto fronts for, to say, okay, if we reduce X in that, we have Y in the other direction. So what we can say here is on average, 1 ton per hectare of soil loss can be prevented with 2.5, more or less, labor days in these 2 regions, and with 2.1 labor days in this region. I think this information is really helpful, for example, if you want to see what kind of subsidies you need to provide for these regions. We can also look at the solutions that are behind these points on the Pareto front, because for every point that we have there is a solution in the sense of a spatial configuration of whether or not we apply the measures. So here I selected 5 points on the Pareto front, and you see the or 6, and you see the 6 maps or solutions that correspond to that. When it's blue, there are soil water conservation measures implemented, and when it's green, they're not implemented. And of course, the lower we go in the labor days we spend, the fewer conservation measures we have implemented. And what we can use this for is to select priority areas. We say, okay, the regions that are, for example, here in the north, there are always conservation measures applied there, irrespective of where this optimal solution is in our Pareto front. That means that that's the place where we should implement measures first, because it's at the same time helps to reduce soil loss a lot and is not that expensive. Yeah. Then I come to the final case study that shows how you can combine geosimulation and spatial optimization. Now, why would you want to do that in the first place? So we now saw before a spatial optimization case study and a Pareto front. So it has this nice line or range when you have uncertainty, and you can compare solutions on this line. However, it doesn't tell you how realistic it is to achieve that optimal configuration in reality. So would it be more realistic to achieve this one or either of them? Then before we saw geosimulation, and with geosimulation we have a different problem, namely that we only evaluate a limited set of runs with the model. For example, 2, scenario A and scenario B. It's nice, we can compare scenario A and B, but we don't know if this point in our solution space would be reachable at all. Now, if we combine the two, we can answer that question. It's unreachable because it's below the Pareto front. The Pareto front contains all optimal solutions, and it's a minimization front. So anything below is just theoretically impossible to reach. So we know that. And when we put scenario A and B in the graph, what we can also see is, we have a business as usual run that brings us quite close to this point in the Pareto front. And also spatially, the configurations are relatively similar. So it shouldn't be too hard to reach this point on the Pareto front. However, this point over here, the nearest solution that we have from the geosimulation model is quite far away. So it may be difficult to reach that. So combining the two basically covers the weak points that the two approaches have. They complement each other. I demonstrate this on a case study of ethanol production in Brazil. It's a relatively old paper of mine, 6 years, I think, but I like this combination, so I want to demonstrate it. I don't know if you're aware of the ethanol production system in Brazil. And here you see a nice map of Brazil in a funny way a bit, but it still helps to depict what it looks like. We have the Amazon forest, which is very big here in the northwest. And then here we have rangelands and agricultural fields. And we have some rangelands also here in the south. Now, in Brazil, we have so-called flex fuel cars. Flex fuel cars, they can not only run on petrol, but they can also run on ethanol and any mix between the two. That's why they are called flex fuel. Yeah, you can have any mix of the two fuels that you want. And the ethanol in Brazil is made out of sugarcane. And the drivers of the cars, they decide what they buy, usually based on the price. And because ethanol brings your car, because gasoline brings your car 3 times further as ethanol. So the energy density is basically 3 times higher. The price difference should also be a factor 3 in order for the ethanol to be interesting economically for the driver. So that's how they decide, but it's a quite complex system. And the sugarcane in Brazil is cultivated in this area. So on the one hand, you could say this is a spatial optimization problem because we have costs and we have carbon emissions that are of interest. And these costs and emissions, they play a role in all different phases of the ethanol production. First of all, in the production phase of the sugarcane, in the land use change phase of the sugarcane. So sugarcane expands. If more sugarcane should be produced, it pushes away the pasture into the forest, and that causes carbon emissions of the above and below ground biomass. Then is also relevant in the production stage. So the machines that are used for the harvesting, they have costs and emissions. And when the harvest is done manually, they use fire to first get rid of the insects before the harvest. That also causes emissions. Then next, in the transport of the sugarcane to the mill, of course, by means of the trucks. And finally, in the conversion process itself in the sugarcane mill or factory. We don't take into account the final phase, the transport of the ethanol to the gas station, because that is has a very low cost and emission relatively, because then the energy density of the product is so high. So we define this as an optimization problem. And what we want to do here is to allocate the fields of sugarcane and the mills, and then minimizing costs and emissions. So what we control, our control variables are the locations of the fields, the locations of the mills, and also the scale or the capacity of these mills. So how many tons of sugarcane per year they can turn into ethanol. If you're interested, this is the equation, but it basically says that we have these 4 stages that I just told you about, and in all stages we have costs and emissions. Then what we also do is build at the same time a geosimulation model of how land use would change automatically, you could say. So in this land use system that we have at the moment, when we increase the demand for sugarcane. So where would these croplands expand according to a land use change model? And then we combine both results. What we get then is the result of the geosimulation model here. It has these production costs and these emissions. And we get out of the optimization this Pareto front, and we can compare the two. This is for 2030 in the Brazilian state Goiás for a supply increase of 10.2 million cubic meters of ethanol. So we can observe several things here. We can look at the Pareto front itself, and what we then notice is that it's very steep here. That's actually a good thing. Namely, it means that we can reduce a lot in emissions by putting in a very small amount of money. So it's cheap to do the first step of cost reduction. That's promising. Here, it becomes a bit less steep. So doing the last bits of carbon emission avoidance is more expensive. It's also always the case if you look at economic theory. Now, what's nice about the place of this business of as usual scenario from the geosimulation model is that we see if we don't do anything, so if we don't implement any interventions in the system, the emissions of this ethanol production are already relatively large. Could be much higher, see? So there are some incentives to be sustainable already in the system itself. What we can also see, it's not optimal. That's logical, right? People don't behave optimally. And what we can do now by comparing the two is saying, okay, how much could we reduce in terms of costs without increasing emissions? Or the other way around, how much could we reduce in emissions without increasing the costs? So we can do something with this difference. We can say to policymakers, well, we could be more sustainable without having more costs for our production, right? So this comparison helps to see how realistic certain measures are. Then what we can do is look at also the solutions behind it again. Here are 3 solutions at the Pareto front, and finally the result of the geosimulation model. What that helps, for example, to see, okay, at the Pareto front, there are always some sugarcane fields and mills over here, and also already automatically in the system if we don't do anything. That's nice. However, here in this region, there are many optimal solutions for sugarcane mills and fields, but if we just let the system be, they don't appear there. So it may help to provide some subsidies to have your sugarcane production over here to make the system more sustainable. I will take your question later because there's one more slide only, okay? Right, so these are the 3 case studies that I wanted to present to you. In summary, we can use geosimulation models to mimic the current behavior of a system, to explore that system. But we can only explore then a limited set of scenarios. That's a disadvantage. Spatial optimization, on the other hand, finds optimal configurations of space and provides us the whole Pareto front, so all possible optimal solutions, given multiple objectives, but without considering the dynamics of the system properly. So for that, we would need the geosimulation model. The 2 methods' weakness can be resolved by combining the 2. So that may help us if we if these weaknesses are a problem for the case study that we have at hand. Thank you for your attention. I will now take questions, but first close the Zoom meeting. So thank you online for attending.